Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. First, I'd like to say, well, it's a great honor. It's a privilege to be here and to just to have a little conversation. I want to define what a knowledge keeper is. I consider myself a traditional man of my culture. It's not an old way. It's not a new way. It's a way of life. It's a way of being since time immemorial. The word knowledge keeper comes from, it's basically a word that how we've had to define ourselves as practitioners. I'm not an elder. There's a difference between elders and elderly. I'm just old, but I'm a practitioner. So that's the word they define myself as a knowledge keeper. I'm comfortable with it most of the time. So I want to make that distinction between what a knowledge keeper is, because a lot of that gets thrown around a lot. There's knowledge keepers, knowledge holders, just whatever word you feel comfortable with. That's how I'm okay with that. So with that, and how we're, the question was how we're dealing with in a traditional way. I think it's very important. I have to go into a bit of history. The newcomers, settlers, been here for the last 500 years, 151 years in Canada since it's created. We've always, I think it's most important that we've always, when the newcomers came, we said to them, we said, you have your way of life, we have ours, we can go down the river of life together. You need to stay in your kind of canoe, we stay in ours, etc. I think that's important because what it's really saying is, to me, it is saying that how empathy is the most important thing. To say that, have that connection. And that's all empathy means, is connected. So I address myself as a human being. We're human beings before we're anything else. I make this distinction. What I mean by that is before our race, before our gender, before our class, before our citizen, before our age, etc., we're the human beings, and we've always acknowledged this. And so as a spiritual practitioner, as my elders always made this clear to me, that's who we are. Remember this. We are the Anishinaabe, and all the tribes have a word for acknowledging themselves as the people, the human beings. As a human being, my bone, my flesh, my blood comes from liquids, minerals of the earth, human. The being comes from our relationship, your relationship, to the sun, sky, universe. All things of the earth have being. The four-leggeds, the crawlers, the swimmers, the flyers, etc., they all have being. But we're the human beings. And I think that's the most important thing, that a lot of people have forgotten this because they're so caught up in all those other identities that the newcomers have imposed on us: race, gender, class, citizen, all these things. We acknowledge them. There's nothing wrong with them. Just secondary things. They always come second. And so our ceremonies, very simply put, remind us of this sense of connection, this empathy we must cultivate ourselves as human beings. So that's the most important thing. I always make this point, and a lot of people dismiss that sometimes because we've almost forgotten what it is to be human beings, and we're in this crisis, right? COVID-19, this thing going on around the world, and I think it's the most important thing to remember this, because a month ago, when I put myself and my family in isolation, I reminded myself of this because I was really concerned about my children, my granddaughter, my friends, my family, and I realized that this is the most important thing to do right now, because a lot of people are going to be stuck in those realities of race and gender and class, etc., and all of this. For example, our southern cousin, their leader is constantly saying those things. And so I think it's important that we identify as the human beings. I always do. And what I mean by that is physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, what does that mean? And so I have to look inside myself and cultivate this thing called compassion and empathy towards all living things. So I decided, and I practice this, I put all my differences aside and said, look, we're in this together, and we have to work together, and our ways of life, our spiritual practices can help if people are willing to listen to us. So that's how I approach it with this whole crisis. And so whatever people are saying, I'm just like, I'm putting all that aside right now and say, we're in this together, we need to work together and put those differences aside. So does that make sense? Hello?
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. I think you're really reminding us of our shared humanity. And one of the things you mentioned earlier as you were speaking was just the identities we carry, which are not really of our own choosing, right? And just that call to remember that shared humanity is really resonating, and also the importance of empathy and compassion as we go through this collective experience.
Absolutely. Because I think it's the most critical, important thing to really to look at and to really honor and to practice. So it's all in the practice. It's very challenging. Right?
So Clay, you just mentioned it's very challenging. How do you, in those challenging moments, like what keeps you grounded? How do you hold on to this idea of our shared humanity, even in the face of some pretty glaring inequities?
Well, again, it goes back to that as a human being. It's critical to really acknowledge that within ourselves and to look at other people as human beings before we're anything else, and the deeper meaning as a human being. And I think it's so important to look at that, and then so that gives us an opportunity to cultivate what I'm talking about is that sense of empathy, connection, right? Because there's so many of those. If you think about it, and you look at the race and gender and class and citizen, they all have their prejudice and biased views, their limited views of reality, right? The reality is that we're human beings. And so it gives a better chance of cultivating those good things in life. And so our medicines, our spiritual practices have always reminded us of this. And this is what my elders have been telling me since the day I set foot in a ceremony, right? And the day they said, this is who you are, Clayton. This is your spirit name. Your spirit name is Running Wolf. And that's translation into English. And this is your spirit. You are spirit experiencing this life, right, as a human being. So it's your responsibility, yours alone, right, to heal yourself. And I take that very, I had to think about that for a long time because I was caught up in this dominant culture, right, of race and gender and class. I mean, historically, we've gone through a thing called genocide, right? I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying this is what happened and this is what's going on, you know, colonization, colonialism, etc. So these impressions have been left in my mind. And so I need to remember this, you know, to remember who I am. And basically, I say to people, if we're going to talk spirituality here, like we are spirit experiencing something, and my elders would always remind me of this. They said, well, you should, it sounds like you don't like yourself. So learn to like yourself. If you want to talk spirituality, it's all about liking who you are as a human being. And that those negative impressions have been left in my mind, in the back of my mind, called colonization, right? So I think it's very important to root out those things, to identify those things and say, okay, I take responsibility here for those impressions left. I didn't put them there, those negative thoughts, those beliefs I carry of self. I didn't put it there. Who did? And how did it get there? And so historically, you have to look at colonization. right? We're all in the process, and that's why I went to, they asked me to come to Waakebiness because they're doing research, and I'm not a researcher, but I've done my own research with practicing my culture, my way of life, my spiritual practices. So it's made me aware of these things, and then the journey called my life, and to heal myself, which is very important, and to root out those impressions, I call them, those of realities. And so it's very important for me to like myself. Because to me, I'll just say this very clearly, spirituality to me means it's meaningless if you don't like who you are as a human being. And that's pretty deep. And so you have to look within yourselves, internally, externally also too, and take that responsibility. And unfortunately, I learned this late in life because I was so caught up in all this other things, race, gender, class, etc., all these other things. So my spiritual practices really helped me to identify this and to like Clayton, basically, in a very simple way. Does that fit?
Great. Thank you so much, Clay. I think in mainstream health practice, a lot of us refer to this WHO definition of health being this complete state of spiritual, emotional, physical, complete belief, well-being, and we don't often take enough time to connect to exactly what you're saying, which is connecting to ourselves as spirit and connecting to spirituality as a way of knowing ourselves and also as a healing practice. So thank you for those words.